Schools are supposed to be places of learning and growth, but some classrooms hold lessons that were never meant to be taught. Lessons written in trauma and tragedy. Lessons that echo through decades, repeating themselves to new students who have no idea they're walking into rooms where something terrible happened and never stopped happening. What you're about to hear are 5 documented accounts from teachers, students, and investigators who experienced something in school classrooms that violated everything they understood about reality. These stories have been verified through school records, police reports, and in some cases, footage that captured things that shouldn't exist. They're real. They happened. And the classrooms are still in use today, still teaching their dark lessons to anyone unfortunate enough to be assigned to them. The first account comes from a high school teacher named Sarah Mitchell, who accepted a position at Lincoln High School in Portland, Oregon in August 2017. Sarah was excited. Fresh out of graduate school with her teaching certification, she was assigned to teach junior English in room 213. The room was at the end of a hallway on the second floor, isolated from the other classrooms. Sarah thought it was perfect, quiet, private, a good space for focused learning. But during her first week of preparation before students arrived, Sarah noticed something odd. Every morning when she unlocked room 213, the desks would be rearranged, not randomly, in a circle. All 28 desks pulled into a perfect circle in the center of the room, facing inward. Sarah assumed it was the night custodian, maybe running a cleaning buffer and moving furniture. She'd rearrange the desks back into rows before leaving each day. But the next morning, they'd be in a circle again. After 3 days of this, Sarah stayed late. She arranged the desks in rows at 5 p.m. and then hid in a supply closet across the hall. She watched through the small window in the door. At 7:30 p.m., when the building was supposed to be empty except for security, Sarah saw the door to room 213 open. Nobody came out. The door just opened. And then, through the classroom window, Sarah watched as the desks began to move. On their own, sliding across the floor with a sound like fingernails on wood, they arranged themselves into a circle. Perfect, precise, as if invisible hands were positioning them. When the last desk clicked into place, the door closed. Sarah left the building immediately and didn't come back until the next morning. She reported it to the principal, a woman named Margaret Ross, who'd been at Lincoln High for 23 years. Principal Ross sighed and asked Sarah to sit down. Then she told her the history of room 213. In October 1994, a teacher named Catherine Webb had taught junior English in that room. Catherine had been beloved by students, creative, passionate, but she'd been hiding severe depression. One afternoon, after dismissing her class, Catherine had rearranged all the desks into a circle. She'd written a note and placed it on her desk. Then she'd hung herself from the ceiling-mounted projector. Her last class of the day found her body when they arrived for 5th period. 28 students walked into room 213 and saw their teacher hanging in the center of a circle of desks. The trauma had been immense. Several students needed therapy for years afterward, and ever since that day, room 230 rearranged itself every night. The desks formed the circle Catherine had created before her death, as if her final act was being endlessly repeated by the room itself. Sarah asked why the school still used the room. Why not close it? Principal Ross explained that they tried, but every time they closed room 213, problems started. Equipment failures throughout the building, unexplained fires, students reporting a woman's voice calling their names in empty hallways. It seemed that Catherine, or whatever remained of her in that room, didn't want to be forgotten, didn't want the room to sit empty. She wanted students, wanted to keep teaching. So the school made a policy: keep room 213 in use. Let the desks arrange themselves at night, arrange them back in the morning, and never, under any circumstances, stay in that room alone after school hours. Sarah decided she could handle it. It was just furniture moving. She could work with that. But 3 weeks into the school year, Sarah started noticing something else. During her 5th period class, the last class of the day, students would occasionally glance at the back corner of the room and go pale. When Sarah asked what they were looking at, they'd shake their heads and say nothing. But one student, a girl named Emma, finally told her the truth. There's a woman who stands in the corner during 5th period. She watches the class. She's wearing a blue dress and she's smiling, but her feet don't touch the ground. She's just hovering there, 3 inches off the floor, watching us learn. Sarah felt her skin crawl. She'd never seen anything. But that afternoon, during 5th period, she positioned herself at the front of the room where she could see the back corner while teaching. And she saw her, Catherine Webb, translucent but visible, wearing a blue dress, smiling, watching the students with an expression that was both proud and infinitely sad. Sarah finished the class on autopilot. When the bell rang and the students left, Sarah turned to face the corner. Catherine was still there. Sarah spoke. "Catherine, is that you? Can you hear me?" The figure nodded slowly. Sarah continued. "Why are you still here? Why haven't you moved on?" Catherine's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, Sarah heard a voice in her head, gentle and tired. "I can't leave them. My students. I failed them once by leaving, by giving up. I can't fail them again. I have to watch over them. I have to make sure they learn. I have to be here. Even if they can't see me, even if I'm just a shadow. This is my classroom. These are my students. Forever." Then Catherine faded, and Sarah understood. The room wasn't haunted by a malevolent spirit. It was haunted by guilt, by a teacher who couldn't forgive herself for abandoning her students, who remained year after year, watching new students learn, trying to make up for the lessons she taught through her death. Sarah teaches at Lincoln High to this day. She still uses room 213. The desks still arrange themselves in a circle every night. And during 5th period, Catherine still appears in the corner watching. Students who are sensitive see her. Most learn to ignore her. And Sarah has made peace with her invisible colleague. Because Catherine Webb, dead for over 25 years, is still teaching the most important lesson of all. That our actions echo. That we can't escape the consequences of our choices. That sometimes, not even death releases us from our responsibilities. Room 213 is a classroom where the teacher never left, and never will. The second story comes from an elementary school in Ohio, where something darker than guilt haunts a 1st grade classroom. In September 2018, a teacher named Michael Anderson started his first year at Riverside Elementary. Michael was assigned to teach 1st grade in room 104, a classroom on the ground floor with large windows overlooking the playground. Everything seemed normal for the first month. 6-year-olds learning to read, alphabet songs, crayon drawings, standard 1st grade activities. But in October, Michael started noticing that his students would sometimes stop what they were doing and stare at the corner near the coat hooks. They'd go silent, completely still, just staring. When Michael asked what they were looking at, they'd say, "The boy." The boy who stood in the corner and watched them. The boy who was always crying. Michael saw nothing. He assumed it was a game. First graders have vivid imaginations. But then one of his students, a girl named Sophia, drew a picture during art time. She drew the classroom with stick figure students at their desks, and in the corner she drew a boy with black scribbles covering his face and body. Michael asked Sophia about the drawing. She said, "That's the sad boy. He stands in the corner every day. He's covered in bruises, and he cries but no sound comes out. I think he's hurt. Can we help him?" Michael showed the drawing to the school counselor. The counselor went pale and asked to see Michael in private. Then she told him something that made his blood run cold. In 2003, a first grade student named Daniel Martinez had been in room 104. Daniel had been a quiet, withdrawn child. His teacher had noticed bruises, but Daniel always had explanations. Fell off his bike, bumped into a door. The teacher had filed concerns with child services, but the investigation had found insufficient evidence. 2 months into the school year, Daniel didn't show up one Monday. Or Tuesday. By Wednesday, police went to his home. They found Daniel's body in a closet. He'd been beaten to death by his father over the weekend. The father was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. But the trauma to Riverside Elementary was enormous. Daniel's classmates had known something was wrong. They'd tried to tell adults, and the adults hadn't acted quickly enough. The school had added anti-abuse training, updated reporting protocols, but it was too late for Daniel Martinez. The counselor explained that every year since 2003, first graders in room 104 reported seeing the sad boy in the corner, always described the same way: bruised, crying silently, standing in the coat hook area. The school had brought in child psychologists who suggested it was a form of collective memory, current students picking up on the residual trauma in the room. But Michael wasn't convinced it was that simple, because his students described details they couldn't possibly know. They described Daniel's clothing, his backpack with a dinosaur patch, things that weren't in any photos displayed at the school, things only someone who'd actually seen Daniel could know. Michael decided to address it directly. During circle time one morning, he asked his students to talk about the boy they saw. At first, they were hesitant, but then Sophia spoke up. "He wants us to tell. He's upset that nobody helped him. He wants us to tell if we're being hurt at home. He wants us to be brave because he couldn't be." Other students nodded. They all agreed. The sad boy was trying to teach them something, trying to prevent what happened to him from happening to them. Michael realized that Daniel Martinez, dead for 15 years, was still in that classroom, still trying to get help, still trying to be seen, and the only people who could see him were other first graders, children the same age he'd been when he died. Michael changed his curriculum. He added lessons about safety, about telling trusted adults if someone hurts you, about being brave and speaking up. He made room 104 a place where students knew they'd be believed and protected. And gradually, the sightings of Daniel decreased. Students still occasionally mentioned seeing him, but they said he looked less sad, less bruised. One student said, "The boy smiled at me today. I think he's happy we're learning his lesson." Michael believes that Daniel's spirit became lighter as the classroom transformed from a place of unspoken trauma to a place of open communication and safety. Daniel was still there, but he was no longer trapped in anguish. He was teaching. In his own way, he'd become the most important teacher in room 104. Michael still teaches first grade at Riverside Elementary. Room 104 has the lowest rate of unreported abuse cases in the district. Students from Michael's class are more likely to speak up, to ask for help, to trust adults, because they learned from Daniel Martinez, a 6-year-old boy who died because adults didn't listen, and who spent 15 years trying to make sure no other child suffered the same fate. Room 104 is a classroom where the student became the teacher, where tragedy transformed into protection, where a ghost refused to rest until his death meant something. And every year, new first graders learn the most important lesson Daniel has to teach. Speak up, tell someone. Don't suffer in silence, because help is real, safety is possible, and your voice matters. The third account takes us to a university lecture hall where time itself seems to have broken. In January 2019, a graduate student named Rachel Kim was assigned to be a teaching assistant for Psychology 301, a class that met in Lecture Hall B at State University in Michigan. The hall was old, built in the 1960s, with tiered seating for about 200 students. Rachel's job was to help grade papers, hold office hours, and manage the classroom technology. Simple enough. But from her first day in Lecture Hall B, Rachel felt something was off. The room had an oppressive atmosphere. The air felt thick, and students seemed unusually quiet when in the space. Not the normal quiet of listening, a suppressed quiet, like fear. 3 weeks into the semester, Rachel was in Lecture Hall B early, setting up for the day's class. She was alone. The lecture wasn't scheduled to start for another 30 minutes. Rachel was connecting a laptop to the projector when she heard a voice. Clear, loud, coming from the back of the hall. Please, I'm begging you, don't make us do this. It's not right. We know it's not right. Rachel spun around. The hall was empty. She called out, "Hello, is someone here?" No response, just echoes of her own voice. Rachel walked up the aisle toward the back of the hall. As she climbed, the temperature dropped. By the time she reached the last row of seats, she could see her breath. And then she heard it again. Not one voice, many voices, dozens, all speaking in overlapping panic. "We don't want to hurt anyone. Please don't make us. This is wrong. This is evil. We won't do it." Rachel ran back down to the front of the hall. She stood there shaking, trying to rationalize what she'd heard. A recording playing somewhere? An echo from another room? But the voices had been so clear, so present, so desperate. When the professor, Dr. James Whitmore, arrived 15 minutes later, Rachel told him what had happened. Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. He asked Rachel to sit down, and then told her the truth about Lecture Hall B. In 1971, the university had conducted psychological experiments funded by a government contract. The experiments, led by Professor Stanley Marsh, involved testing obedience and authority. Students were told to administer electric shocks to subjects who answered questions incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the students didn't know that. They believed they were hurting people. Many students refused. Some complied, reluctantly. The experiments were designed to test how far people would go when ordered by authority figures. The experiments in Lecture Hall B were particularly intense. Professor Marsh pushed students hard, threatened their grades, insisted they continue even when they begged to stop. Several students had psychological breaks during the experiments. One student attempted suicide days after participating. The university quietly shut down the program after a journalist exposed it in 1972. Professor Marsh was fired. The students involved were offered counseling, but many never recovered from the guilt and trauma. And ever since those experiments, Lecture Hall B had been strange. People heard voices, felt overwhelming guilt and anxiety when in the space, Some students refused to attend classes held there, claiming the room made them feel like they were doing something wrong, even when they were just sitting and listening to lectures. Dr. Whitmore explained that he taught Psychology 301 in Lecture Hall B for 8 years. Every year, someone on his staff reported hearing the voices. Always the same pattern. The voices of students from 1971, begging not to be forced to hurt others, trapped in a loop of their trauma, endlessly reliving the experiments. Dr. Whitmore believed the room had absorbed the emotional energy of those experiments, the fear, the guilt, the moral anguish, and it played back those emotions to anyone sensitive enough to perceive them. Rachel asked why they still used the hall. Dr. Whitmore's answer was unsettling. Because it's the perfect place to teach psychology students about the dangers of unethical research. Every person who hears those voices learns, at a visceral level, why informed consent matters, why protecting research subjects is crucial, why authority should never override individual conscience. Lecture Hall B teaches that lesson better than any textbook. Rachel continued working in Lecture Hall B, though she never felt comfortable there, and she heard the voices 3 more times that semester, each time in the early morning when she was alone setting up, each time the same desperate pleas echoing from the past. But Rachel also noticed something else. Students who had classes in Lecture Hall B performed better on ethics assignments. They showed more critical thinking about authority and obedience. They questioned things more readily. It was as if the room's traumatic past was actually enhancing their learning in unexpected ways. The ghosts of those 1971 students were still teaching, still warning, still saying don't do what we did, still trying to prevent future generations from making the same mistakes. Lecture Hall B is still in use at State University. The psychology department still schedules classes there, particularly ethics courses. And every year, a few students or teaching assistants report hearing voices. The university acknowledges it privately, but dismisses it publicly. But those who've heard the voices never forget them. Never forget the lesson that Lecture Hall B teaches. That experimentation without conscience is torture. That following orders doesn't absolve responsibility. That some choices leave scars on the soul and echoes in the spaces where they occurred. The hall is a classroom where the past refuses to stay silent, where trauma speaks, where the victims of unethical research still cry out, hoping someone will finally listen. The 4th story involves a high school chemistry lab, where an accident created something far worse than chemical contamination. In March 2020, just as schools were closing for the pandemic, a chemistry teacher named Dr. Linda Foster at Westfield High School in Massachusetts was alone in her lab doing inventory. The lab, room 312, was a standard science classroom with long black tables, gas outlets, sinks, and storage cabinets full of chemicals. Dr. Foster had taught there for 12 years without incident. But that afternoon, while organizing supplies in the storage room at the back of the lab, she heard glass breaking in the main classroom. She rushed out and found a beaker shattered on the floor. Nothing unusual. Glassware breaks. But as Dr. Foster cleaned up, she noticed something odd. There were footprints in the spilled liquid, small footprints, a child's footprints, leading from the broken beaker to the door, then disappearing. Dr. Foster checked the security. The doors were locked. She was alone in the building except for one security guard on the first floor. Nobody could have entered the lab, yet there were the footprints, clear, undeniable, and they were fresh. Dr. Foster followed them to the door and out into the hallway. The footprints continued, getting fainter, leading to the stairwell at the end of the hall, and then they stopped. just ended at the top of the stairs, as if whoever made them had simply evaporated. Dr. Foster reported the incident to the principal, but didn't make a big deal of it. Strange things happened in old schools. She assumed there was a rational explanation she just couldn't see. But when school reopened after the pandemic shutdown in September 2020, Dr. Foster started experiencing regular occurrences in room 312. Equipment turning on by itself, gas valves opening when nobody was near them, and most disturbing, the storage room door would lock from the inside. Dr. Foster would find it secured with the deadbolt thrown, even though she was the only person with a key and the deadbolt could only be engaged from inside the storage room. Someone or something was locking itself in that storage room. Dr. Foster contacted the previous chemistry teacher, a man named Gerald Morris who'd retired in 2008. She asked if he'd ever experienced anything unusual in room 312. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Gerald said, "You've seen her, haven't you? The girl in the storage room." Gerald told Dr. Foster a story that had been kept quiet for 50 years. In 1970, a freshman named Emily Carter had been serving detention in room 312. Her detention assignment was helping the chemistry teacher organize the storage room. But Emily had been curious. She'd started experimenting with chemicals, mixing things without supervision. She'd created a toxic gas, chlorine gas, based on what investigators later determined. Emily had been overcome by the fumes. She'd tried to escape the storage room, but in her panic, couldn't unlock the door. By the time the chemistry teacher returned from a brief hallway conversation, Emily was dead, locked in the storage room, poisoned by gas she'd accidentally created. The teacher was cleared of negligence, but the trauma ended his career. The school had updated safety protocols, installed better ventilation, changed how detention was supervised, but they couldn't change what had happened to Emily Carter. Gerald explained that he'd experienced Emily's presence throughout his tenure at Westfield High. She was trapped in the storage room where she died, replaying her final moments, trying to unlock the door, trying to escape the gas that had killed her 50 years ago. Sometimes she'd succeed in manifesting physically enough to break something or leave footprints. And once a year, on the anniversary of her death, the storage room would fill with the smell of chlorine even though no gas was present. Gerald had learned to live with it, to acknowledge Emily's presence, to speak to her before entering the storage room, explaining what he was doing, assuring her she was safe. It had made the activity less intense, as if Emily calmed down when she understood she wasn't alone. Dr. Foster began following Gerald's advice. She'd speak to Emily before opening the storage room. "Emily, it's Dr. Foster. I'm just getting supplies. Everything is safe. You're safe." And the activity decreased significantly. Dr. Foster even set up a small memorial in the storage room, a photo of Emily from the yearbook, a note saying, "Remembered, honored, at peace." Students who had classes in room 312 sometimes reported seeing a girl in the storage room doorway, always described the same way, 14 years old, wearing 70s style clothing, looking confused and frightened, but she never hurt anyone, never interfered with classes. She was just there, trapped in the moment of her death, reliving her fatal mistake over and over. Dr. Foster reached out to Emily's family, what remained of them. Emily's younger sister, now in her 60s, came to the school. She visited room 312. She stood in the storage room and spoke to her dead sister, apologized that Emily had been so young and scared and alone when she died, told her it was okay to let go, to stop being afraid, to move on. After that visit, the activity in room 312 changed. Emily still appeared occasionally, but she looked different, less panicked, less desperate. One student reported that she saw Emily smile before fading away. Dr. Foster believes that acknowledgement, that being remembered and spoken to directly by family, gave Emily some measure of peace. She's still in room 312, still bound to the place where she died. But she's no longer trapped in terror. She's just present, a reminder to every chemistry student who enters that lab. Respect the chemicals, follow the procedures, pay attention, because mistakes can be fatal. And 50 years later, Emily Carter is still teaching that lesson. The fifth and final story connects all these accounts because it reveals a disturbing truth about schools and trauma. In 2021, an educational psychologist named Dr. Marcus Webb conducted a nationwide study of paranormal reports in schools. He collected data from over 800 schools across the United States, and he found something that explained why schools, particularly older schools, had such high rates of reported supernatural activity. Schools, Dr. Webb theorized, are emotional amplifiers. They're places where hundreds or thousands of young people experience intense feelings every day: joy, fear, anger, grief, love, humiliation, triumph. The sheer volume of emotional energy released in schools is staggering. And when trauma occurs in a school, when death or severe harm happens within its walls, that trauma leaves an imprint far deeper than it would in other locations. Dr. Webb found that 93% of schools reporting paranormal activity had experienced a violent death or severe trauma on campus. Suicides, murders, fatal accidents, abuse cases, and the intensity of the haunting correlated directly with the age of the victims. The younger the person who died or suffered, the stronger the haunting. Elementary schools had more intense activity than high schools. Dr. Webb believed this was because young children's emotional energy is more raw, more unfiltered, more powerful than adolescents or adults. When a child dies in a school, especially if that death involves fear or pain, the energy released is so intense it literally alters the space. It creates what Dr. Webb called an emotional recording that plays back indefinitely. But Dr. Webb found something else, something that suggested these hauntings might serve a purpose. Schools with acknowledged ghosts, schools that didn't try to suppress or deny their haunted classrooms, had lower rates of new trauma. It was as if the presence of the past prevented repetition in the present. Students who knew about the sad boy in room 104 were more likely to report abuse. Teachers who knew about Catherine Webb in room 213 were more likely to recognize signs of depression in their students. Students who heard the voices in lecture hall B were more resistant to unethical authority. Chemistry students who learned about Emily Carter were more careful with dangerous materials. The ghosts were teaching. They were warnings. They were protection. Dr. Webb's final report included a controversial recommendation. He suggested that schools should acknowledge their ghosts, create memorials, tell the stories, let the dead teach their lessons rather than trying to pretend they aren't there. Because denial doesn't end a haunting. It just makes the spirits more desperate, more active, more dangerous. But acknowledgement, respect, and learning from the tragedy can transform a haunting from a curse into a guardian. The dead don't want to be forgotten. They want their deaths to mean something. They want to prevent others from suffering as they did. And schools, more than any other institution, have the power to turn tragedy into teaching, to let the ghost speak, to learn the lessons written in trauma, to remember. These are 5 accounts from haunted school classrooms, And if you're a teacher or a student in an old school building, pay attention to the spaces that feel wrong, the classrooms that are too cold, the corners where students stare at nothing, the rooms that have a heaviness you can't explain. Because those spaces are trying to teach you something. The dead are still present, still trying to reach you, still trying to ensure their suffering wasn't meaningless. And the lessons they teach about safety, about ethics, about compassion, about consequences, those are lessons written in pain and death. Lessons that can save lives if we're willing to learn them. The classrooms are full, not just with the living, but with the dead, who never graduated, who never left, who stayed behind to teach the most important lessons of all. Listen to them, learn from them, honor their presence, because in these haunted classrooms, education never ends. The dead are eternal teachers, and their curriculum is written in tragedy that we can prevent if we pay attention to what they're trying to teach us